Hey everybody, I'm so excited. Over the next couple of weeks, I just want to try something different, something new for you all. I know that all of us are looking for something in these moments and in these times to just encourage and strengthen us. And for me, I've really looked to the book of Philippians. And that book has just really spoken to me at numerous levels and numerous ways because it's just a book where Paul was going through really hard times and a lot of struggles. And so it's just really encouraging to me because somehow he finds ways to talk about joy and hope and possibility in that scripture and in those passages. So over the next couple of weeks, I'm just going to talk through the book of Philippians, what I'm calling 5 minutes in Philippians. I'm going to try and keep myself short. I know not everybody has a lot of time, and we don't want to spend our time on screens any more than we have to. So we're going to kind of keep it short and do it quick. Today's going to be a little bit longer because I just want to set the stage for what the book of Philippians is about. Kind of what's the context, what's the background of the book of Philippians. One thing that we know for sure is that Paul is the author of Philippians. As you read through the book of Philippians, you will find time and again mentions of individuals and people that Paul came across. And he's going to talk at several occasions about some of the things he's going through in that time. So it's pretty clear Paul's the author. He's the one writing. And we know Paul, of course, from the book of Acts as this kind of great gospel evangelist who went throughout the Near Eastern world spreading the gospel of Jesus. And so we know that that's kind of who wrote the book of Paul. When it was written, we guess is probably about 61 CE. So Paul was likely in Rome in prison. And he was actually probably under house arrest at this point. That sounds pretty familiar to a lot of us right now. Paul's confined to a home. He has limits to the people he can see and he can have contact with. And he has pretty limited ways of communicating with people outside of that home. But what he decides to do in that moment is he decides to start writing letters, especially letters to a lot of churches that he has encountered in the past, places he's been, people he knows, these groups of people that he was pivotal in their life in the past, and he wants to encourage them. He wants to strengthen them. So he's in the middle of being imprisoned and having everything limited in his life, and yet he finds a way to reach out and connect with somebody. Yeah, I think that by itself is just a cool moment for us to think about in our own space, that as restricted as we are right now, who is it we can think of in our past that we might need to write a letter to, we might need to encourage, we might need to strengthen in some way. And so that's what Paul does. And in fact, as he's sitting in prison, he thinks, I think, about other places where he was in prison. And that's some of the groups that he writes to. And in Philippi, he was actually in prison, which is why maybe this is why he writes to this group, which is just really interesting. So we know some things about the city of Philippi and how Paul came to be connected with them because it's in the book of Acts. So the next couple weeks will be in Philippians, but for today, let's look at Acts chapter 16 and the story of when Paul came to Philippi for the first time and kind of see what the city of Philippi is like, what it was like for Paul to be there as he connected with these folks and with these people. So starting chapter 16, verse 11 in the book of Acts, it says, from Troas, this is Paul and Silas, the group he's traveling with, we put out to sea and we sailed straight for Samothrace, and the next day on to Neapolis. And from there we traveled to Philippi, a Roman colony and the leading city of that district of Macedonia. And we stayed there several days. So Paul travels to the city, and even here in the book of Acts, you can tell that Philippi is important, right? It says this is an important city. This is the leading city of the district, right? It is an important place. And in fact, Philippi was actually named for King Philip, who was the father of Alexander the Great, right? So it's an important city for Greeks and for Greek culture, Greco culture, but it also becomes an important city for the Romans. When the Romans take over Philippi and conquer it, they actually make Philippi a colony, which means that anyone that is born in Philippi is also a Roman citizen. And citizenship is going to become interesting in the book of Philippi. Paul's going to use this idea of citizenship in Philippians 3 when he talks about how we are citizens of God and citizens of heaven, right? That we are, this should be the citizen that we hold strongest to. So citizenship is an important thing. This is an important city. Very likely it was populated with a lot of soldiers, especially retired soldiers, who went there to retire. because it was a Roman city. It was an important city. It was a cheaper city to live in than it would have been to live in Rome. And so these soldiers and these soldiers' families that were connected to the church in Philippi, when Paul talks about kind of what it is to press on towards the goal, they would have understood that language, right? That made sense to them because they had goals, they had things that they were tasked to do as soldiers, and they did it with their utmost ability. But Paul also talks about humility, and he talks about self-confidence and how self-confidence can be distracting. And those would have been hard things, I think, for those soldiers and their families to hear from Paul in this letter to the Philippians. So we see both this sense of encouragement, but also this sense of kind of pushing folks in a little bit of new way and a new attitude. So this is the city that Paul's in, and as he comes into the city, it says in verse 13, on the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the river where we expected to find a place of prayer. So this is Paul's pattern. You read through the book of Acts, he does this all the time. When he comes into a new city, he looks for the river or he looks for the synagogue. And in fact, most synagogues were built by a river so that people could go down to the river for ritual cleansing of some kind. And so this is a pretty common thing. And so Paul would always know when he came into a new city where to find the synagogue, where to find the people gathering for prayer, because he would go down to the river and look for people that were gathering. You know, when the Jews were exiled in the Babylonian exile, way earlier in history, the temple had been destroyed. And the Jewish people had to find a new way to worship. And synagogues were their way to do that. They became attached to the Hebrew scriptures. And they said, you know what? We don't have the temple. We can't go and make sacrifices. We can't do all the things we're used to doing. Sounds pretty familiar, right? We can't do all the things we're used to doing. So what we're going to do is we're commit ourselves to the scriptures. We're going to commit ourselves to the word. We're going to gather together, read the word together, talk about it together, right? And be encouraged. And so Paul knew when he came into a new city that if he could go find the place of prayer, the synagogue, that he could be in a place with people who were committed to the scriptures, who were committed to seeking God, and then he could talk to them about how those scriptures talked about the Messiah. Right? So this was his strategy, right? This was his way. And I think for us, that by itself is instructive. That for us, it's as we're evangelizing, as we're thinking about those people we can share the gospel with, it might not be that like committed atheist that you know at work who is going to want to argue with you about the historicity of the Bible. That's probably not your best effort. Your best effort might be to find the person who's seeking and looking for God and say, hey, let me show you the truth that I found. Let me show you the Jesus that I know. Let me show you a little bit more about who he is. And that's exactly what happens here. So read on verse 14. So Acts 16, verse 14. One of those who was listening to Paul when he came down to the river was a woman named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth from the city of Thyatira, who was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message, and when she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. If you consider me a believer in the Lord, she said, come and stay at my house. And she persuaded us. So we have Lydia, who is this very interesting woman. She is one in a long line of women we've seen throughout the Gospels and now throughout the book of Acts and throughout some of these letters of Paul, that a woman that has followed hard after Jesus, that is committed to Jesus, committed to the work of Jesus, committed to following after him. So Lydia had not been born a Jew. She had converted. She was called a worshiper of God, right? So this is a title for a Gentile that's converted to Judaism. So she's looking for truth in Judaism. And Paul shows up and offers her the truth of Jesus, which is even more inspiring to her. The other thing we can guess about Lydia, because the way she's described is she's probably a widow or a single mom. She's a business owner, she's a businesswoman, and she's a head of a household, because it says her whole household comes to believe and follow. And there's no husband mentioned, right? There's no other name mentioned here. So our best guess is Lydia was a single mom. She was a widow. My guess is that because she's a dealer in purple cloth, she's going down to the river to wash the cloth, to wash the dye out of the cloth. She sees these women praying together, and she wants that community. She wants that connection. And so she goes and meets with these women, learns about their God, Yahweh, and then this guy, Paul, shows up. And he introduces her to Jesus. And that's when she's inspired and when she's strengthened. And what we know about the story, because as we'll see in the book of Philippi, is that she continued to invite other women, other single moms, other widows, other women into the church with her. that she used her influence with others and with other women to invite them in to the church, because Paul will mention several other women's names in the book of Philippians that come to the gospel and that know who he is. So the other thing that's told in the book of Acts, and I won't read the whole story, is that after Lydia's converted, Paul and Silas stay in Philippi and they continue to talk about the gospel. And they do some miracles, they do some cool stuff, but the leading citizens of Philippi get mad at Paul and Silas and they put them in prison. And while they're in prison, they're preaching to the other prisoners, they're singing hymns, and God sends an earthquake to knock down the prison walls, to open the doors of the prison, and Paul and Silas could have easily escaped. And the jailer runs in to find out what's going on, to see if they're still there. And Paul and Silas are still sitting there. And they witness to the prison guard and his whole family, and they're converted to faith in Jesus. And so there's this moment in which Paul and Silas could have done whatever they wanted to do, right? They could have left that prison. They could have left that place that they were in and just decided, you know what, it doesn't matter. We're going to get on our own. They could have, right, had that sense of kind of self, that they wanted to do whatever was for themselves and this kind of selfish ambition, but they waited because they knew God wanted to do something more. And I think for us right now, stuck in our homes, many of us are looking for ways to escape, and we're thinking about, well, maybe this would be okay. Maybe that would be okay. And maybe God's telling us, maybe the commandment to love one another is the highest commandment, and that the way that we can show our love to each other is by staying put, by being okay, by showing, as other people are looking at us as Christians, of how are you living? What are you doing? How are you acting in this moment of crisis? That we can demonstrate what we're doing is we're saying, you know what? We're going to stay where we are. Yes, we would love to gather together. We would love to worship together. We would love to get together in groups. But we know that's what's more important is to love our neighbor by staying where we are. And that's hard and that's challenging, but it's the truth. So there's so many lessons here just in this story of kind of the letter that Paul's writing, that he is in prison, right? He is in this place of confinement, and he's looking back on his life at the other people that he can encourage. So who's somebody that you can encourage today, that you can look back on your life and find a way to encourage them? Who is somebody like Lydia that you can bring into community with you and with your family, that you know is isolated, that's lonely, that's alone right now, that you can go and reach out to and show them the love of Jesus? And how can you demonstrate your faith in Jesus right now? By staying put and waiting till God is done telling the whole story. I hope it's encouraging to you. I would encourage you over this weekend, if you get a chance, sit down and just read the whole book of Philippians. It's not very long, take you about 15 or 20 minutes. And then over the next couple of weeks, twice a week, we're going to release just a 5-minute video kind of walking through 12 to 15 verses and just kind of what God's showing us in the story. I really believe that this book is just a really encouraging book. It's a book of joy and hope and possibility. And I hope that you get something really powerful out of it. Hey, my blessings on you. I'm praying for you all today. I hope you have a wonderful day. Yeah, amen.